Hello, students. Today is another wonderful day to learn something new in social studies with me, Mrs. Monker. Today's topic is the middle passage and auction. But first, you will need The Making of the Bahamas by Dawn Maples, a highlighter, a pen, and a notebook. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to define the middle passage and other related terms. Examine and explain how slaves were treated on board the ship. List what happened to the slaves once they arrived to the New World. Identify and differentiate between the two types of slave auctions. In case you missed our last lesson, let's recap. The Lucayan Indians were the first group of people enslaved in the Bahamas. They were enslaved by the Spaniards under the encomienda system. The Lutheran adventurers came to the Bahamas in 1648 under the leadership of Captain William Sales. The Lutheran adventurers brought slaves with them when they came to the Bahamas. The Loyalists arrived to the Bahamas in 1783 from the U.S. after the American War of Independence. They brought with them their skills, ideas, plantation system, and, of course, slaves. Africa was the home of several great empires, such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These places flourished before the arrival of the Europeans. Most of the slaves who came to the Bahamas were direct descendants from these empires. The triangular slave trade was a three-way triangle linking Europe, West Africa, and the Americas. Hope you're ready. Let's get started. We are to listen to a short story about a slave boy. But first, let's look at some slave definitions. Some of these definitions will occur in the story, so listen out for them.
The horror I can still remember in my mind, and the stench I can still smell in my nostrils. Even though these events happened about 50 years ago, it seems like it was only yesterday when I was taken after a group of men burnt my village to the ground. "Mama!" I screamed. "Papa!" I shouted. But all I saw was smoke. As I was tossed over the shoulder of one of the men like a bag of straw. Once the village was out of sight, we met up with the others. Yes, there were many men and women and children, old, young, short and tall, chained together by arms and legs in a band called a coffle, headed to the coast. On the way there, all sorts of evil happened. I saw people who were whipped by the factors as they struggled to keep up with the others. There was an old man near to me who looked very ill. One of the factors took him and tied him to a tree and left him to be eaten by wild animals. As we continued on our way, we finally reached the coast after walking about 600 miles. We were branded with the owner's mark. Unbeknown to us, this was our new identity. Growing up, I heard stories of how persons became slaves as a result of being captured, sold to pay off a debt, or as punishment. At only 12 years old, however, I never thought that I would be telling the narrative about my life as a slave. The horror of an uncertain future, the hurt of not seeing family again, and the anger of becoming somebody else's property. My name is Adoba, and I am from the Ashanti tribe. This is my life as a slave. Once we arrived at the coast, we waited for a long period of time. Hundreds of thoughts were rushing through my mind all at once. Fear and anger overshadowed most of my thoughts as I waited to be examined and branded. When the hot iron touched my skin, I screamed. I knew my life was no longer mine. I called it the mark of the beast of slavery. We were kept in a barracoon, like animals. This was a bamboo cage, After some time, a huge ship arrived. We were taken out of the cages for another inspection before we boarded the ship. A man looked in my ears, mouth and eyes, then nodded his head, which meant I passed the inspection. But Macrons, those that did not pass the inspection, were killed right on the spot. The boat ride across the Atlantic Ocean took about 8 weeks. We were kept below deck with barely enough room to move, like sardines in a tin or books on a shelf. We were allowed on deck to exercise once daily. The air was so fresh. The sky was a beautiful blue, and the rays from the sun glistened on my dark skin. The food and water we were given was never enough. Once we were finished, we were held down below deck once again. What I call the dark dungeon of death. The stench of sweat, blood, urine, feces, and vomit, along with the heat, kept me in a constant state of queasiness. I prayed for death, but it wouldn't come. At least not for me. Many died by the dozens, either from suffocation, sickness due to the unhygienic conditions, and even suicide. I watched a mother throw her child overboard, and then she jumped shortly after. If there's truly a place called hell, this must have been it. This is what I thought to myself. The groans and cries of my African brothers and sisters, below including myself, was inconceivable.
After listening to the story, you may feel empathy or sympathy towards Aduba. This is quite normal. However, you may be required to use these emotions as a skill when writing your answer for a structured question. Remember, there is a difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is a noun. It means the ability to identify with or understand another's situation or feelings. Sympathy is also a noun. However, it means a feeling of pity or sorrow for the distress of another. Now, let's put it into practice. Imagine you are a slave during the Middle Passage. Give a detailed account of your experience. 5 marks. How will you answer that question? Well, let's do some more research, and hopefully by the end of this session, you will have your answer. The Middle Passage was the most important leg of the triangular trade. It linked West Africa and the New World. It was a dreadful journey for the slaves on board the slave ship. It lasted 6 to 8 weeks. The conditions on board the ship were horrible. The slaves were fearful because this was a new experience for them. Millions of slaves had made this journey, and millions have also perished. A slave ship carried about 500 to 600 slaves. Slaves were stacked like books on a shelf or like sardines in a tin, with very little space to move around, not even elbow space. Many slaves died from diseases. The ship became a stinking mass of human waste. The slaves were chained together in their positions. Therefore, they had to relieve themselves of all bodily excretions right there where they laid. Many died from suffocation and heat stroke due to poor ventilation below the deck. Also, many slaves preferred to die and tried to starve themselves by refusing to eat. The slaves that would not eat were whipped or force-fed. Some slaves tried to commit suicide by jumping overboard. The slaves were permitted on deck for a few minutes every day. This was so that they can eat small bits of food, get some fresh air, and exercise. Because the slaves were so fearful and did not understand what was happening, they would be whipped, which will cause them to move and jump around, which would have been their form of exercise. Many slaves thought about fighting back. However, many of them did not speak the same language because they were a part of different tribes. Also, they were fearful without weapons. The few that tried did not succeed. Some of them wore iron muzzles or were whipped or even tried to jump overboard during such instances.
From about 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homeland and forcibly shipped across the Atlantic, a journey that almost 2 million of them wouldn't survive. By the turn of the 18th century, European merchants were building vessels capable of transporting hundreds of slaves per journey. These ships had extra portholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments added below deck to take on more human cargo. Before boarding the ships at African port cities, slaves were stripped of their clothing and remaining possessions and had their heads completely shaved. During boarding, which could take weeks or even months, slaves lived on the deck of the ship in a temporary wooden house constructed by the crew. The crew also installed netting around the deck of the ship, designed to catch slaves who might opt for death over forced servitude. Once moved below deck, slaves would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage. They were segregated by gender and age. Adult men were kept separately and shackled in pairs. Women usually left unbound in their designated compartment, and children often free to move about the ship. There was no plumbing of any kind. Slaves were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, creating hellish conditions when combined with the heat and lack of ventilation below deck. Disease was rampant. Measles, smallpox, influenza, scurvy, and dysentery, the #1 killer, ravaged slaves and crew members alike. The slaves generally spent about 8 hours a day above deck, but were still separated by gender with a barricado, a reinforced wall that could be used to protect crew members in case of a revolt. Slaves were also subject to forced exercise, sometimes including dance and song for the entertainment of the crew. Disobedient slaves were tortured and beaten, usually whipped with the especially cruel cat-o'-nine-tails, a tool designed to inflict maximum pain. Slaves who refused to eat their typical meal of rice and beans were forced to do so, sometimes with the speculum oris, a medieval tool used to pry open unwilling mouths. Women, while usually left unshackled, were raped and sexually abused by members of the crew, sometimes arriving in the New World carrying the children of their attackers. But it was the women, using their minuscule freedoms, who would often coordinate mutinies against their captors. But these rebellions were rarely successful. The true extent of the horrors of the Middle Passage came to light in a 1783 court trial over the slave ship Zong. The Zong left Africa in 1781 with 442 enslaved on board. After a 2-month journey riddled with navigation errors, 62 slaves and 7 crew members had perished without reaching their destination. Disease was spreading throughout the ship, and fresh water was running dangerously low. Captain Luke Collingwood was afraid of the financial cost of more deaths. Slaves that died of disease were not covered by the ship's insurance, but slaves who drowned were. Some 133 slaves were thrown overboard. Collingwood claimed it was necessary to do so to halt the spread of disease. At the trial between the Zong's owners and their insurance company, the owners argued that because it was legal to kill sick animals for the health of a ship, it was legal to treat infected slaves the same. The court agreed, but the trial itself exposed the horrors aboard the Zong. The story was republished by British abolitionists with the name of the ship redacted, meant to show that this tragedy could happen on any slave ship across the Middle Passage. 24 years after the Zong trial, the slave trade was outlawed in both Great Britain and the United States. It would take England another 26 years and the U.S. another 58, plus a civil war, before the practice of slavery was banned outright.
Once the slave ship arrived at a West Indian or North American port, the Africans were put up for sale at auction. If a slave survived the Middle Passage, he or she would usually be given a thorough wash and extra food for a few days to make it seem as if he was healthier than he actually was. The slave auction itself was another new and terrifying experience for slaves. The Bahamas was well situated on the transatlantic trade routes to receive slaves brought from West Africa. Ships on their way to North America would often stop in Nassau. Therefore, Bahamian planters, like the Loyalists, got first choice of the best slaves. An auction would be first advertised in the Bahamian Gazette. The place where slaves were sold was called the Vendue House, which is now the Pompey Museum in Nassau, downtown Bay Street. There were two types of slave auctions: sold to the highest bidder auctions and the slave scramble. With the highest bidder auction, the slaves stood on a raised platform so that the buyers could see them. Before the bidding began, buyers would come up on the platform to inspect the slaves closely. The auctioneer would decide a price to start the bidding, and potential buyers would then bid against each other. The person who bid the highest would then own the slave. Next was the scrambling, which was commonly known as the grab and go auction, which was more terrifying than the other. The slaves were divided into small groups for which prices were fixed. At a signal, the planters rushed on board the ship and grabbed as many slaves as they could, which led to slaves being injured seriously. Many slaves were frightened, and they flung themselves overboard and drowned.
(1841), New Orleans, ground zero for the slave trade.
How much?
It's auction day, the day every slave fears the most. In the first half of the 19th century, over 500,000 slaves are sold at auction. It's a business worth $2 billion to the Southern economy. Since the cotton boom, the value of slaves has skyrocketed. Now men cost $1,000, women $800, children $500. Solomon Northrop, an educated free man from the North, was kidnapped into slavery.
Go, boy, you come over here.
He would make us hold up our heads, walk us briskly back and forth, while customers would feel our hands and arms and bodies. Make us open up our mouths and show our teeth, precisely as a jockey examines a horse which he is about to barter for or purchase. Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit and hurt his sale.
90% of all African Americans are slaves. 4 million men, women, and children.
We had based this country on everyone having inalienable rights to freedom and equality, and yet we created a system of abject persecution.
Slaves are fattened for auction, like livestock. Dark-skinned men are bought for the fields, light-skinned women for the house. Traders lie about their ages, even dye a slave's gray hairs.
For the plantation owners, it was like just going to your local supermarket to get sugar or flour. They had become so desensitized to the humanity of the slave that they did not see them as human beings.
Buyers demand the most fertile slaves for breeding. The most expensive are light-skinned teenage virgins. Rape is common. Eliza's from a state plantation. She's being sold with her 2 children, Emily and Randall. In Louisiana, it's illegal for children under 11 to be taken from their parents.
Boy, come over here.
It happens all the time.
You know, 140 years is not a really long time in the context of history. So it's hard for me to believe that blacks didn't have any rights here. They weren't treated as human beings. They were treated like animals, essentially.
Sir, please.
All right, you go over there. There's your business,
Oh, my love.
Over half the sales at auction will tear a family apart.
If you've ever been 8, to think of being separated from your mother and your father and sold and you'll never see them again. The horror of that, the poignancy of all of that, and yet that's the kind of thing that happened across the South up until the end of slavery.
Okay, my final offer. 1,000 for that man. Yep. 900 for that man. The woman there, $700.
Please, buy my child. Sir!
I have seen mothers kissing for the last time the faces of their dead offspring, but never have I seen such an exhibition of intense grief as when Eliza was parted from her child.
Come on, out. You go.
I hope you enjoyed the lesson so far, but most importantly, I hope you understood what was taught. It's now time to put on our thinking caps. Imagine you are a slave during the Middle Passage. Give a detailed account of your experience. This question is worth 5 marks. Step number 1 in your attempt to answer. Think about 5 things you remembered about this lesson as it relates to the Middle Passage. Quickly, let's go through my top 5. Slaves died. No space. Punishment. Limited food. Long boat ride. Step number 2. Write at least 1 sentence about each thought regarding the Middle Passage. Remember our top 5 ideas. Slave died, no space, punishment, limited food, long boat ride. Now, let's attempt to put them into sentences. Many slaves died during the Middle Passage. There was hardly enough space to move around. Some slaves were punished if they tried fighting back. Slaves had very little food to eat. The ship took a very long time to reach the New World. Step number 3. Ensure that your sentences are well developed and the explanation about each experience is different. Now, let's read that question again. Imagine you are a slave during the Middle Passage. Give a detailed account of your experience. 5 marks. Now, let's try our answer. I had a horrible experience during the Middle Passage. Many slaves around me died from diseases and suffocation. It was so many of us that there was hardly enough room to move around. We were like books on a shelf. I was whipped as a form of punishment for trying to fight back. Some slaves were close to starvation because of the lack of food. The ship took at least 6 weeks or more to reach the New World. Remember, students, to describe or give an account of an experience that you would have never had, you must use empathy and sympathy and then connect it with the facts. Let's look at another question. The slave scrambling auction was more frightening than the highest bidder auction. Do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer fully. 5 marks. How do we attempt to answer this question? Well, let's look at step 1. Decide if you agree or disagree with the statement. You may choose either yes or no, or you may decide to choose both. Step number 2. Write at least 3 supporting sentences based on the side you choose, along with a conclusion. For example, if you choose yes, then you would write, yes, I agree that the scrambling auction was more frightening to the slaves than the highest bidder auction. This is because, and that is where you would write your 3 supporting sentences and then a conclusion. If you choose no, then you would write, no, I disagree with the statement. The scrambling auction was more frightening to the slaves than the highest bidder auction. This is because, again, you would then write your 3 supporting sentences and then a conclusion. Step number 3. If you wish to give a 2-sided response or a balanced answer, then consider the following. Yes, I agree with the statement that scrambling auction was more frightening to the slaves than the highest bidder auction. This is because, and then you would write your 3 reasons in complete sentences. After which you will attach the following. However, I also disagree with the statement because. There you would write 2 reasons why you disagree in complete sentences. Then finally, you would include, I conclude by saying that slavery was a terrible experience for slaves, and the slaves' auction just made matters worse. You did a very good job. I am so very proud of you.
The thing that distinguishes slavery in Africa from Atlantic slavery is race. Europeans set in motion a system of slavery that was predicated on the idea that certain people were marked as enslavable.
We've learned a great deal about the Middle Passage in the last 40 years or so. The volume of the trade involved the removal of about 12.5 million people from the African continent.
The Middle Passage was the middle leg of a voyage that starts in Europe. The first passage is from Europe to Africa. The Middle Passage is the journey from Africa to America. And then the third passage is the journey back from America to Europe.
The Middle Passage could take anywhere from 2 to 3 months. Men and women were separated. Men typically were held in the lower belly of the ship. The roof, if you would, was quite low, probably about 4 feet high. So people couldn't stand. African men were shackled together, and they were packed so closely together in a spoon-like position. And they would stay like that for pretty much the entire journey.
You're talking about hundreds of people. You're at 120 degrees. It smells terrible. There are actually people dying around you, which has to be a traumatic experience for everybody on board.
Maybe 10% of voyages, we know there was some attempt to rise up, to kill the crew, to try to turn the boat around, to change their destinies. Historians have a hard time capturing what the Middle Passage must have felt like for enslaved men and women. It's a voyage that is deeply disorienting. It's a voyage to a place that you can't anticipate. You don't know what's going to happen to you. I don't think we have adequate words to capture that experience.
I know this ain't home, but it's where you gotta be.
Now, let's take a few minutes to review the definitions that we learned earlier at the beginning of this lesson. I hope you learned something new today in social studies. Remember to study smart and not hard. See you soon.